You know, Dr. Thema Bryant-Davis is a psychologist, author, ordained minister, and sacred artist who has worked nationally and globally to provide relief and empowerment to marginalized persons. She explores the interdisciplinary understanding of spirituality, gender, culture, and psychology in her body of work and how women can navigate the existing institutional and social structures. My colleague Liesl Wilson caught up with her ahead of Women's Day.
Dr. Thema Bryant-Davis, thank you very much for making time to chat with us here on Weekend Dawn.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation.
As you know, we in South Africa are celebrating Women's Month, Women's Day, and obviously as we celebrate the strides that we've taken as a nation and even as the world, you know, there are obviously a lot of barriers for women that continue to permeate and obviously disadvantage women at large, which when we look at it, ultimately disempowers the world at large. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome you to the show and perhaps just start off by looking at the cause of the fragility that we're currently experiencing in the world today. I mean, looking at some of the historical context, narratives, societal and institutional constructs. How have we landed up in this situation in 2020?
So thank you so much for having me. I am so glad and honored to be here. And it is important, as you said, for us to look at the realities of oppression and sexism historically. And so even though there are ways in which there has been progress and ways in which we have evolved, these structures and systems are taught, they are baked in, and they continue to be both perpetuated and maintained. So it is beyond just individuals having negative perceptions of women, but it really is about systemic oppression and patriarchy and the ways in which we are routinely silenced. And when we think about these experiences as trauma, so my background is in psychology, and often we think about individual forms of trauma, which is very important when we consider sexual assault and childhood abuse and sex trafficking, but it is also important to think about collective trauma. And so racism is a collective trauma, sexism is a collective trauma, and that there is a transmission, a passing down of the trauma wounds that we then carry today. Some people call it ancestral wounds. So we have both the historical part and the contemporary reality. And it is necessary to use our voices in power as you're doing with the program today.
So we have to learn, unlearn, and relearn a lot of the constructs and narratives, as you mentioned, that might have been inherited or we've just not simply looked at, consciously enough. I'm looking at developing some of the indicators that we use currently to define an empowered woman at large. I mean, what do these indicators look like? Do you think they're sufficient enough? How do we rework that narrative to actually serve us and create a new reality?
This is so critical because until we really analyze and unpack the problem, we won't be clear about, as you're naming, the solutions, right? How do we look for indicators of growth as well as indicators of continued oppression? And one of the things I think is important for us to attend to is that sexism is multidisciplinary. So that means it attacks us on multiple levels. And so in order to address it, to resist it, to counter it, we need action in each of those areas. And so when we look at the educational system, looking at the curriculum, when we say these are the great writers, when we say these are the great inventors, who are the women that are included in that list? And when we consider even in medicine, the differences in the research funding that is given to issues and problems that primarily face men versus reproductive issues and challenges that particularly face women. When we consider in politics, who are the voices and the ways in which they receive support, or even the sexism that occurs within campaigning and leadership assumptions. And we have to also consider in our religious institutions, those that are promoting and celebrating women and women's leadership and women as sacred beings, and those that are tearing us down, that are a part of the problem. And we also have in our parenting, right? These socializing messages of what do we tell our sons and daughters? How do we treat them? Who do we invest in that we believe is going to carry the family forward? Who do we honor and who do we shame? And so in every level, we have to look for indicators of growth and indicators of stagnation. And that's the beautiful part about resistance, is all of us can play a part. So it's about looking at what is my area of expertise, or what is my lane, and the ways that I can contribute to the empowerment, the wellness, the safety, the liberation of girls and women.
It sounds like we cannot do this in isolated occurrences. We need both men and women to come on board. I just want to look at women and how we navigate the power structures that currently persist and exist in society today, and also the role of men in playing a part, for the emancipation of all. What does this look like in practical terms?
Yes, it is important that it is a collective issue. Women's liberation, women's empowerment is not just an issue for women to address, but it is for all of us. I would say for women, for us to be careful about internalized sexism. Internalized sexism is when I come to believe the lies I've been told about women. So if I'm the only woman I like, that's a problem. If I say, I don't like dealing with women because women are this, women are that, and you're sitting there as a woman, then that is a matter of internalized oppression. You have bought into the lie of your own inferiority. And so we have to be careful about how we affirm and speak about ourselves, and also how we respond to other women. So the reality is the sky is big enough for all the stars to shine, but many of us get into that scarcity mentality. There can only be one or a few women in leadership or women in power. And so then people get in those positions and block other women. How problematic and short-sighted and narrow-minded and fear-based. But to really operate from a place of abundance is to say, even as a trailblazer, even if I was the first, I will not be content to remain the only. Even if I'm the first, I cannot be the only. So I have to clear the path and mentor and guide and advocate for more women to be able to come into those places, so that we're not the exception, but so that it is the norm. Mm-hmm. And then I would say for men, it is so important to be an advocate, because there are going to be times when you're in rooms where there are no women present. And if only women will speak up on the issue, nothing will ever shift. And so to take seriously your role as an ally means to be willing to make a sacrifice, to be made uncomfortable, that when you speak up for the rights of women, some men are going to push back. Some men are going to call you names. Some men are going to ridicule you. And are you willing? Do you have the interior, psychological, moral fortitude to stand up against that and speak up for what is right? And then not only to be an ally, but to be an advocate, to be able to create spaces for women to achieve, for women to prosper, and for women to be safe and well. And this goes from the very small, people will call it microaggressions, when you hear people making jokes about women or insulting or demeaning women, that our silence is a part of the problem. Psychiatrist Judith Herman wrote these words: "It is easy to side with perpetrators. All they require is your silence." And so when we are silent in the midst of sexism, we are supporting the status quo. And so to be willing to use our voices, and as you said, not to combat it alone, but to know we are many, we are many, we are many. And so a part of decolonizing is recognizing the voice, the power, the contribution, the glory of women.
And in the same breath, we're just looking at the movements that are taking place. I mean, we've got the Black Lives Matter movement that's gained global traction. There's the #Me movement that's come out. We're seeing that black and white challenge, obviously stemming from Turkey. And then Dr. Thema also looking at how South Africa, arguably has one of the highest gender-based violence and femicide rates in the world. I mean, looking at what it means to be a woman in 2020, what gives you hope? as you see these movements gaining traction, what gives you hope that things are shifting, the dynamics between men and women are shifting, and that there is hope for a brighter future?
It is definitely a time of hope and mobilization. The momentum is in our favor. And so for us to really grab a hold, as you say, that these are national and international movements, global movements, and seeing intergenerational commitment and turnout, seeing men and women show up, seeing people of diverse races speak up and say that equity is necessary, that justice is necessary. When I look here in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement, that in the middle of a protest will break out in song and dance, as you all have done in South Africa. And so a part of our protest is our joy, right? A part of our protest is our art. A part of our protest is our spirit. And this is important in order for it to be sustainable. And that's why many movements have been led by people of faith, because not only are we guided by our outrage, but by our hope. And that is what sustains us. In the States, we say it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And you all know that very well. Across the generations, it's not a short fight, it's a long fight. But when we look at the realities of justice and the necessities of equity, then we know we're on the winning side.
And we've also got many tools out there. So I'm looking at the fourth industrial revolution that's currently obviously having the world migrate into. You've also got COVID-19, which many have said obviously has exacerbated the inequalities, but it's also given us some time to pause, reflect, reassess, reinterpret, reevaluate. I mean, what do you think these waves of change are doing for the fight, for equality, equity, inclusivity at large?
Definitely, there are the racial disparities and gender disparities in terms of COVID-19, access to health care, and seeing that not all people are being confronted with the realities of this medical pandemic, this global pandemic at the same rate. And at the same time, as you name, it has required us to take inventory about where we are nationally and globally, and to not be able to distract ourselves with busyness. Many times we're running and rushing and we are not mindful or tuned into the reality, but we have been forced to be still, in some cases to be silent, and to see that people are even willing to risk their very lives to go out and speak up and protest in the midst of it all. An important awareness during this time is that we are not waiting to go back to business as usual, that it will never go back to the way things were, that people are awakened in brand new ways. And so this is fertile ground for revolution when people discover not only does the old way not work, but I couldn't go back to it if I wanted to. That once you are awakened, you can't unsee what you see. And so now people who were not even interested in justice issues are wondering, what can I do? How can I contribute? What is it that is needed? And so we have to really go with this momentum so that we can have sustainable change and sustainable growth, and something we call in psychology post-traumatic growth. So in the aftermath of the trauma of COVID, gender-based violence, sexual assault, racism, who will we be after this? For us to grow in our sense of meaning, for us to grow in terms of our own strength, for us to grow in relationships, for us to grow in our spirits. And so this is prime time. It's a difficult time, but there is beauty that can be born out of the trauma.
I'm just going to conclude by asking you, what is your advice for the women of South Africa, for the women who are watching on the continent and the world at large during these unprecedented times?
I would say to the women of South Africa, do not believe the lies that you have been told about yourself. You are more fierce, more powerful than we even recognize. That there has been a concerted effort to talk you out of your power, but it is a lie. The truth is you are beautifully and wonderfully made, and the world will come to see it.
Drops mic. Dr. Thema, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for those words of wisdom. Thank you for standing in solidarity with not only the women in South Africa, but obviously the world over. The time for change is now, and we are leading it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.